Hey everybody, can't sleep, so I figured, you know what, let me do another video. So fun. I'm actually going to show you guys just a lot of the different wrestling merch that I have. Um, some more DVDs, t-shirts, everything like that. So first, I'm going to start out my JCW football jersey, Juggalo Championship Wrestling. Um, gotta represent the Juggalos. Let's see. Next is one of my favorite wrestling promotions. I actually got this at National Pro Wrestling Day, but it's CZW's Wrestling Fears CZW t-shirt. Let's see, next will be, okay, come here you. One of my Ring of Honor shirts for Homicide. I actually cut the sleeves off of it. That's the front. The back. This shirt I actually bought from Homicide. Actually one of my favorite shirts. Lucha Thug on the front. Notorious 187 on the back. Okay, this is actually a Japanese wrestling program for Joshi Wrestling, autographed by 3 of the Joshi I actually got to meet at Jersey All Pro Wrestling. Inside, like I said, you can see this is definitely from Japan. A couple of these young women I actually got to see through Chikara, as well as Jersey All Pro. Next is my Kaiju Big Battle book. Most people don't consider this wrestling, but you know, it definitely is. These guys are definitely trained in professional wrestling. I got to see them at a show at BB King's, and then I got to see them again at National Pro Wrestling Day. They're actually going to be doing a show at WrestleCon, so I wish I could get there for it, but unfortunately, I can't. Let's see. Get back into a couple more DVDs. I have my Joshi Mania DVD, which, as you can see, is autographed. I actually have 4 autographs on it. I've got I've got 3 of the members of the Batiri. I have Kodama, Oberion, and I can't think of the other one now. Cobalt. And I also have Sarah Del Rey. So you can see the 2 right there. Got Sarah's autograph on the back with another member of the Batiri. In case you're wondering, like I did with the last one, I'll go over some of the matches that are on here. Was Ultramantis Black versus Brody Lee, Cherry and the Colony versus Toshi Uematsu and the Batiri, Kaori Yoneyama versus Mayumi Uzuki, Manami Toyota, Shimano, and Nakamura versus Aja Kong, Shadi, and Kuragaki. And then the main event was Sarah Del Rey versus Akio Hamada. Next DVD will be CZW's Tournament of Death 7. Now, I actually do have a couple of different autographs on here. If you look on the front, I've got Pinky Sanchez. Then, let's see, on the back, I know I've got Danny DeMonto. I have Wax. And I want to say I have, I'm not sure who the last one is again, to be honest. It's been a while. Either Greg Excellent or Ryan McBride, I think, but those are the ones on the back. You know, the matches in here Tables, ladders, and light tubes, Pinky Sanchez versus Danny DeMonto. Loose light tube match, Mickey Knuckles versus Scotty Vortex. Barbed wire boards and light tubes, Wax versus Die Hard Dustin Lee. Anything Goes, Falls Count Anywhere, Andy Sumner versus DJ Hyde. Panes of Glass, Drake Younger and Nick Gage versus Devin Moore and Drew Blood. Barbed Wire Massacre, Greg Excellent versus Ryan McBride. Light Tube Bundles, Danny Havoc versus Necro Butcher. And then non-tournament match was Ruckus and Sabian versus Joe Gacy and Alex Colon. Next is Ring of Honor Death Before Dishonor 6. I wish I was at this show. This show was actually my first venture into Cage of Death. I'd never seen Cage of Death before I saw this show. So the match is on here. Seth DeLay versus Delirious, Colt Cabana and Jay Lethal versus Jimmy Rave and Sal Renaro, Jay and Mark Briscoe versus Irish Airborne, Davey Richards versus AJ Styles, Ring of Honor Pure title match, Nigel McGuinness versus Roderick Strong, ROH World title match, Bryan Danielson versus Sanjay Dutt, and the Cage of Death Team ROH of Samoa Joe, BJ Whitmer, Adam Pearce, Ace Steel, and a mystery partner versus Team CZW of Chris Hero, Necro Butcher, Claudio Castagnoli, Nate Webb, and a mystery partner. Next one is CZW When Two Worlds Collide. This was actually the second show of a deadly doubleheader with Ring of Honor. I do have the DVD. I'll show you maybe in another video. But the matches on here, you had Sanjay Dutt, B-Boy, and Adam Flash versus Messiah, Sexy Eddie, and Nate Webb. Hollow Wicked versus Andy Sumner versus Jigsaw versus Larry Sweeney. Justice Payne versus El Generico. Panes of Glass for the Ultraviolent Underground title. Nick Gage versus Danny Havoc versus DJ Hyde. CZW Iron Man title match. Super Dragon versus Kevin Steen. Ladder match for the CZW Junior Heavyweight title. Sabian versus Heretic versus Cheech versus Cloudy versus Niles Young versus Derek Frazier. And then an interpromotional tag team match for the main event, which ended up being a 6-man. Ruckus, Eddie Kingston, and the Necro Butcher for CZW versus Matt Sydal, Roderick Strong, and Austin Aries for Ring of Honor. Let's see. Next, we have Jersey All-Pro Wrestling Women's Division Girl Power. This is actually the third women's. I'm kind of going backwards with the women's shows, so you'll see 2 and 1 later on. The matches on here were Cheerleader Melissa versus Haley Hatred, Sassy Stephanie versus Fate, Andy Social versus Autumn Breeze, Andy Social versus Mia Yim, Brittany Force versus Allison Wonderland, Allison Danger versus Ariel. And for the JP Women's title, you had Sarah Del Rey versus Cheerleader Melissa. Next, we have JAPW Women's Division, A Queen is Crowned. Matches on there. We have #1 Contenders Battle Royal, which ended up being the final part of it ended up being a match. Sarah Del Rey versus Haley Hatred. Sarah Del Rey versus Awesome Kong. Raisha Saeed versus Daisy Hayes. Andy Social versus Amber. Cheerleader Melissa versus Nikki Rocks. Roxy Cotton versus Brooke Carter. And then to crown the champion, Sarah Del Rey versus ODB. There are also a couple of bonus matches in here. Valentina versus April Hunter. Nikki Rocks versus April Hunter. And Alicia versus Sarah Del Rey. Next is Ring of Honor 7th Anniversary Show. And on here, you've got Roderick Strong and Eric Stevens versus Rhett Titus and Kenny King. Brent Albright versus Claudio Castagnoli. Adam Pearce versus Bobby Dempsey. Jerry Lynn versus Mike Quackenbush. Revolution Rules match. Tyler Black, Delirious, and Necro Butcher versus the Age of the Fall, Jimmy Jacobs and Brody Lee, and Austin Aries. Then you have Bison Smith and Jimmy Rave versus Bryan Danielson and Colt Cabana. D'Lo Brown versus Jay Briscoe. World Tag Title match. Kevin Steen and El Generico versus the American Wolves of Davey Richards and Eddie Edwards. And then ROH World Title match, Nigel McGuinness versus Kenta. Alright, next we have Jersey All Pro Wrestling Women's Division, Female Revolution. This was the first women's show, all women's show for Jersey All Pro, and it took place back home for them in Bayonne. Now the matches on here, we had Jennifer Blake versus Portia Perez, Cheerleader Melissa versus Nikki Rocks, Roxy Cotton versus Sassy Stephanie, Sarah Del Rey versus Daisy Hayes, Raisha Saeed versus Ariel, Annie Social versus Marie Lollipop, and ODB versus LuFisto in a last woman standing match. Next match we have is, well, next show, DVD, Jersey All Pro Wrestling Halloween Hell. We have bonus match, I guess I'll do first, from Beechwood, was a tag team title street fight, LAX versus the Heavy Hitters, and Dan Moff versus Danny DeMonto. But now for the actual matches for this show, you had Bandito Jr. versus the Insane Dragon, The Best Around versus the Hot Shots, Angel Orsini versus Amy Lee, Chris Dickinson versus Chase Del Monte, DNA, Dixie and Azriel versus the Garden State Gods, and the main event was Dan Moff and Rhino versus Danny DeMonto and the Grim Reaper. Now, I actually do have this autographed by both members of the Garden State Gods, Mike Quest and Corvus Fear. Mike Quest signed it right there, and believe it or not, up here where you can see a little bit of red, that ended up being Corvus Fear. Why he insisted on signing it in red is beyond me, but he did. So, mind you, I was at this show. There's actually a spot in here during the WSU title match where I actually end up getting elbowed during the match, so that's kind of fun for me. Let's see. Next we have CZW, no pun intended. Funny thing is, this actually took place behind a strip club here in Jersey. Let's see, the matches on here. Ryan McBride versus LJ Cruz, Alex Colon and Joe Gacy versus The Reason and Adam Cole, Greg Excellent versus EMO, Cheech and Cloudy versus Andy Sumner and Drew Gulak, Ruckus versus Drew Blood, John Dahmer versus Danny DeMonto, Pinky Sanchez versus Sanjay Dutt, an Unlucky 13 staple gun match, DJ Hyde versus Z-Bar, and the main event was Drake Younger versus Trent Acid. Let's see. Next, we have Jersey All Pro Wrestling Holy Ouch. Let's see, here, match-wise, we have Danny DeMonto and Corvus Fear versus the Ecstasy Express, Alicia versus Daisy Hayes, Delirious versus EC Negro. For the tag team titles, you have the Outcast Killers versus Jay Lethal and Azriel. For the JPW Light Heavyweight title, Grim Reaper versus Bandito Jr. Then you have Matt Cross versus the Human Tornado versus Matt Sydal versus Arcadia. B-Boy versus Eddie Kingston. And then for the JPW Heavyweight title, Loki versus Necro Butcher. Ooh, something doesn't sound right in there. Let me fix it quickly. There we go. Let's see. Next, we have Jersey All Pro Wrestling Spring Massacre. Let's see, the matches on here. We have Kevin Matthews versus Wes Draven, Daisy Hayes versus Sarah Del Rey, Slick Wagner Brown versus Arcadia, the Christopher Street Connection versus the Moose Squad, of Alicia and Cha-Cha. Then we have for the tag team titles, the Outcast Killers versus EC Negro and Bandito Jr. For the New Jersey State title, the Grim Reaper versus Azrael. Then for the JPW Heavyweight title, Low-Ki versus Samoa Joe. And the main event ended up being the Strong Style Thugs, Homicide and B-Boy, versus Eddie Kingston and Chris Hero. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, that match itself is something that nobody thought would ever happen because of the shoot hatred between Hero and Kingston. I'm surprised that match took place. Next we have, and this is actually something because this is the first ever Jersey All Pro show I ever attended, Jersey All Pro Wrestling Wild Card 3. So here's how the matches went. Kevin Matthews versus Fantastic Max, Outcast Killers versus Danny DeMonto and Corvus Spear, Deranged and Cha-Cha versus Bandito Jr. and Melissa Stripes, Slick Wagner Brown versus Monster Mac, Daisy Hayes versus Alexa Thatcher. For the New Jersey title, Frankie Kazarian versus the Grim Reaper. For the tag titles, Jay Lethal and Azrael versus Homicide and B-Boy. And the main event was for the vacant JPW Heavyweight title in an 8-man gauntlet match. Low-Ki versus Rhino versus Chris Hero versus Davey Richards versus Delirious versus Human Tornado versus Ruckus versus EC Negro. Let's see, next we have JPW 9-year anniversary show, which actually I have autographed by Fat Frank, the promoter of Jersey All Pro Wrestling. That's actually how he signed it for me. And the show here, we have Danny DeMonto versus Corvus Spear, Danny DeMonto versus Axel Rotten, Low-Ki versus Arcadia, Alicia and LuFisto versus Alexa Thatcher and Melissa Stripes, the Christopher Street Connection versus Biff Wellington and Sexy Eddie, Low-Ki versus Tyler Black, Frankie Kazarian versus B-Boy, Battle of the Light Heavyweights 9, Chuck Taylor versus Ricochet versus Arcadia, versus Human Tornado versus Grim Reaper versus El Generico, Jay Lethal and Azrael versus the Outcast Killers versus the SAT, and then the main event for the title was Low-Ki versus Teddy Hart versus Homicide versus Necro Butcher. Okay, let's see. Here's the last couple DVDs. Let's see, there's Jersey All Pro Wrestling Wild Card 2. Matches on here are Alicia versus Mercedes Martinez, Monster Mac versus Trent Acid, Monty Brown versus EC Negro, Frankie Kazarian versus Xavier, the SAT versus the Briscoe Brothers versus the Outcast Killers, Azrael versus a wild card mystery opponent, Rhino versus Jay Lethal. Next, we have Jersey All Pro Wrestling Homecoming. Here you have the Outcast Killers versus All Money is Legal, a 3-way dance, XS69 versus Eric Cooper versus Sexy Eddie, the H Effect versus Nino Capone and Arcadia, Trent Acid versus the Sandman, Beef Wellington versus Shark Boy. For the light heavyweight title, B-Boy versus Azrael. And then for the heavyweight title, Jay Lethal versus Steve Corino. Next, we have Jersey All Pro Wrestling Base Brawl 2. Here you had Chino Martinez versus Kevin Matthews, April Hunter versus Ariel, Skinhead Ivan and Rockin' Rebel versus Hip Hop Overflow, Alex Law versus Ricky Landell, Danny Doring versus Pinky Sanchez, The Solution versus the Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Ash Samuels versus The Wasp, Steve Corino versus Slick Wagner Brown, Low-Ki and Trent Acid versus Sanjay Dutt and Teddy Hart. Now, the last DVD I'll show you is actually one I really love. I love this wrestler. It is Sami Callihan's The Best of the Indies DVD, Confessions of a Switchblade, the Sami Callihan story. Great DVD. It's um, 3 DVDs, as you can see. There's 1, 2, and then 3. Disc 1 is pretty much an interview with Sami and one of his matches, actually his very first match, as Cannonball Callahan, I believe his name was, or Cannonball Sami, as he took on Nigel McGuinness for the HWA. Then here it's Sami Callihan versus Dingo for IWA Mid-South. For his own promotion that he had, American Lucha Corps, a street fight between him and Johnny Gargano. Him versus Drake Younger for Mid-South. Him versus Kingston for Mid-South. Too Cold Scorpio for Mid-South. Him versus Butcher for Mid-South. Roderick Strong for East Coast, for IWA East Coast. Michael Elgin for IWA Mid-South. Last man standing match, him versus Greg Excellent for CZW. Versus B-Boy for Mid-South. Versus Egotistico Fantastico for CZW. Tangled Web match, Drake Younger and Scotty Vortex versus the Switchblade Conspiracy of Sami and Moxley for CZW. Bed of Nails and Nail Strips, him versus Havoc for East Coast. Cage of Death, him versus Havoc for CZW. Sami versus Sabian versus Ryu Lee versus Ophinian for Force 1. The Switchblade Conspiracy versus the Young Bucks in WXW for Germany. Versus Moxley for CZW, versus Hero for Force 1, versus Joker, versus a 4-way pretty much, him versus Joker versus Gargano versus Taylor for CZW, versus Rich Swann for Force 1, versus Masada for CZW, and then versus Robert Anthony for CZW. And that's pretty much the end of the DVDs. Now, the last couple things I have to show you are some of my masks. I will say this is actually it's like a generic mask that I own. If anybody does know Lucha Libre a little better and you do recognize this mask, please tell me who it is. I would actually like to know. Now the next two I definitely know who they are. Let's see, first I'll start off. This is actually my first mask I ever got. I actually bought it at a Hot Topic because I actually recognized the mask. They were selling it about when Nacho Libre came out, and this is actually Octagon, or Octagoncito, whichever one you want to think of, but Octagon. I do wear them actually here. Matter of fact, I'll put Octagon on. So yeah, that's me in the Octagon mask. And then the last one is the Funky Pharaoh from Chikara. I actually bought from the Chikara stand at National Pro Wrestling Day. It is the Funky Pharaoh Amasis. So, this is pretty cool. And well, as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll be back more. And yeah, I'll see you guys ringside. Later.